Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd better make a start. My congratulations to, or commiserations with, those of us who are survivors of the all-day Popper conference yesterday. This today is the 18th lecture on critical rationalism, and today I'm going to be talking about Popper on history. And just as it were to give you a warning about what is then happening, there will, on the 30th, be a lecture on Popper and the philosophy of social science. Sorry, that's on the 3rd of October. On the 10th of October, there'll be Popper and ethics. On the 17th, Popper and aesthetics. And then on the 24th, I'm finishing off this first series of lectures with a lecture on Popper the person. What was he actually like, and what was he like to work with? So today then, Popper on history. A starting point is really going to be with Popper's repudiation of historicism and its consequences. Popper offered a critique of the idea which, on both wings of politics at the time when he was interested in political matters particularly, tended to be shared on both the far right and the far left. The notion that there is a predetermined course to history, or that anticipations of the direction of history should dictate where we should be going morally. History is on our side, historicists would say, or indeed aesthetically, that the true artist or the true musician is the musician of the future, who spots the direction in which things are going and gets there first. Popper's criticism of these things obviously links to his political ideas, but as we'll see in a subsequent lecture, it also plays an important role in many parts of his ideas about aesthetics. In politics, Popper, in contrast to this sort of view which he's criticizing, stresses our responsibility for what happens and sees politics as the attempt to give, as it were, an ethical meaning to things which otherwise are intrinsically meaningless. People's lives for Popper have meaning, but history as such doesn't. But we can, however, attempt in his view to give a meaning to what takes place in history, at least in the bit of it with which we're engaged, by way of efforts to try to improve our society, to make it and its workings and the lives of our fellow citizens work better. Note, however, that the subject matter of history, the subject matter of politics, is a product of the actions of individuals. And accordingly, one may hit difficulties about how the macro level giving of meaning relates to the day-to-day activities of the individuals involved. And as you probably got fed up with my saying now, I mean, there may be clashes between what's needed by some of the mechanisms which we may need to have in place if our society is going to function well, between the consequences of these and our ethical concerns. But there's also another kind of issue. That's to say that we may well have preferences in the large, as it were, for how a society might work, where what we're exercising our preferences over are things which are the product of perfectly reasonable, free decisions that individuals take, and one might say on the face of it, are perfectly entitled to take. And there may be a tension here between our wish to engage in social engineering to impress a particular kind of ethical character onto the world, not just positive or utopian, but also negative, and on the other side, to what people simply want to do. And there may be ethical issues about the legitimacy of our trying to shape this material when what is being shaped is basically the ordinary and in themselves innocuous activities of other individuals. That's to say, there's an ethical issue concerning what the relationship should be between, say, a majority wishing our society to have certain overall characteristics, and the fact that one thing standing in the way of the realization of this may be individuals acting on the basis of ideas that seem to them to be perfectly sensible and completely ethical, and in respect of which they are respecting the rights and freedoms of other people. And against which, to those people, as it were, the ones who want the large-scale change can't really produce telling arguments. If some people think that what they're doing is realizing ethical goals that their religious or wider moral ideas give to them, we may not approve of these, we may not like them, but we may not be in any position to argue that their views here are incorrect or illegitimate. What, by contrast with historicism, does Popper make of the course of history? On his account, it's a matter of our understanding what takes place as the product of the actions of individuals and of their unintended consequences. Individuals have to be understood as socially situated. I discussed Popper's ideas about this in the course of the earlier lecture about Popper and Marx. There's also methodological individualism. I'll say more on this topic in a later lecture on the philosophy of social science. But for now, first I should say there is amongst philosophers in the latter part of the 20th century, what seemed to me to be in some ways a rather silly literature about methodological individualism, focusing on concerns about what Popper and some people who've been influenced by him were taken to be favoring. In my view, the literature and its character wasn't helped by, in part, a lack of clarity on the part of those who favored methodological individualism. And also there should be a possessive tendency not to address the issue in the, in the context of actual social science. What do I mean by this? Well, I think one of the problems coming out of the literature about methodological individualism is that sometimes it's not altogether clear what the proponents of methodological individualism are saying in their view, was in their view, should be the methods that the social sciences should be following. And indeed, in my view, if one looks at the people who favor methodological individualism, one might, in this literature, distinguish between two approaches. On the one side, there's the approach of economists and more generally of rational choice theorists, people who, in effect, extend the kind of approach that was developed within microeconomics to the study of politics and other social sciences. They tend to take individuals implicitly in social situations, but they tend not really to talk about situations or the setting at all, but they just tend to take individuals as acting on the basis of their preferences, and suggest that we should use rational action on the basis of preferences as a key tool for understanding social phenomena. By contrast with this, there's an approach to be found, for example, in the more individualistic aspects of Max Weber's work. I say this just because he is, I think, more of an individualist in his methodological writings than he's been argued to be in some of his more political work. But within such an approach, individuals are understood to be acting on the basis of their theories about the world and of their customs and habits and traditions, which will typically be shared with other people. And here, a clear task of the historian, or if the people being studied are alive, of the ethnographer, will be to discover what these are, which may involve both attempts to interpret the ideas of these people, and then possibly also the testing out of these interpretations to see to what extent, if perhaps a particular group of people shares certain views, certain interpretations of things, how typical are they of other people who might fall into the same kind of category. But in each case, methodological individualism stresses the need not just to understand the individual actors' actions, but also to explore their typically unintended and often unanticipated consequences as well. So both of these approaches are concerned with rational human action, but in some cases, and the rational choice theorists and the economists typically tend to think that they can do their work perfectly well just sitting behind a desk and simply assuming how people are motivated, whereas people on the more Weberian side tend to say, well, what the perspective is of members of a religious sect, or social justice warriors, or something other of this kind, is in a sense something that has to be actively discovered. But once one has done this, one can then both get inside the ideas, but also try and understand what the consequences are if people act on the basis of these ideas, both directly, but also in terms of what the unintended consequences might be. There's a clear contrast between either such approach and what one gets in Emil Durkheim. For example, his concern with so-called social facts as revealed by statistics, such things as differences in suicide rates between different kinds of populations, and by contrast with that, purely psychologistic explanations of phenomena such as suicide. But in this context, it seems to me, proponents of methodological individualism should, I think, have clearly stressed that their emphasis was on socially situated human actions, and with both meaning and unintended consequences, although it's then going to be a matter for argument as to how much investigation needs to be done as to what the character of the actions are. It will obviously be a matter of argument too as to what level of abstraction is appropriate. And there are different elements to this. I mean, people might say, well, a key idea concerning the social sciences is that what's going on is the product of individual action. And one might agree with this, but one could then say, okay, but how is it appropriate to represent that? We presumably don't want to have to name each particular individual. At another level, one might make very abstract generalizations, which it might be said kind of get us away completely from the concrete phenomena with which we should be concerned. There are indeed also other issues here as well. That's to say, to what extent should the social scientist working as a methodological individualist be guided by or even restrict themselves to the understanding of things that the individual agent themselves has? Or, for example, is it appropriate to introduce theoretical ideas, for example, such as Keynes's notion of so-called liquidity preference, which could be explained to actors and which certainly makes sense of a range of things that they're doing, but which wasn't until people read the literature by economists dealing with these sorts of things, the kind of terms in which they would describe their own actions. And indeed, this issue of what level of abstraction is important and how one should proceed here seems to me to be something where one has to make conjectures and then test out their fruitfulness, rather than being something that one can extract analytically from knowledge about the actions of the individual. Note also, though, that in my view, proponents of methodological individualism should also have brought in structural constraints on people's actions. These are, to be sure, produced by people's actions and their unintended consequences, but they may nonetheless serve to constrain us. We may find that we're acting in a period of inflation. We may find that the economy in which we're acting is going through a trade cycle. There may be various kinds of things of this character, such that the setting in which we're acting is something which is constraining us, but in ways where, as an individual, it may not be very readily intelligible as to what's going on. It might require the development of theoretical social science to try to make sense to us of what kind of thing is happening. These things, it seems to me, can have a thing-like character with emergent properties that can affect us, rather than they're simply constituting the setting in which we're acting. Two kinds of things are worth referring to here. The first is that there may be a path dependency to aspirations which are going to be at all easily achieved. What do I have in mind? Well, people in other countries in Europe and elsewhere might look at what countries such as Denmark and Sweden have been able to achieve in terms of the social policies they have followed and how their institutions work. And they might wish to adopt those kinds of approaches to social problems in their own countries. However, an issue that would seem to me to arise is that those societies, Denmark and Sweden, for example, have gone through a distinctive pattern of social, intellectual, and economic development, which may be rather different from, for example, that of the population in Britain or the United States, where people might be looking with admiration at that. What I have in mind includes such things as a distinctive ethical legacy from what is now pretty much a secularized Lutheranism. And I can give you an example of this. I was taking part at one point in a visit by some people who were trying to develop a program of kind of collaborative program between Australia and some European countries in things to do with applied ethics. And I and some friends ended up in a hotel in Helsinki. And I'd agreed to meet someone from the philosophy department in the hotel lobby at 9 o'clock, from the philosophy department at a university in Helsinki. And at all of, I would guess, 15 seconds past 9 o'clock in the morning, I got a telephone call to my room. And the gentleman I was meeting was calling to say very politely, "Where are you?" And it was clear, as it were, that in Helsinki, things ran in a particular kind of tightly rule-bound manner. By contrast, for myself as an Australian, if you schedule a meeting at 9 o'clock, you would expect the people to assemble at possibly 5 past. The meeting might actually take place at 10 past. And all I'm pointing to here is a certain kind of difference in custom and habit. No one was right or wrong about this, but it's just that how people were behaving and their background and traditions would have meant that one had both to recognize this and to agree explicitly what was going to be done in order for mutual arrangements to work well. One might also say that in both Denmark and Sweden, modernization seems to have taken place with educated peasant farmers really playing a leading role. And this seems, together with the Lutheranism, seems to have given an ethos to what was going on, which contrasts with that in countries like Britain and the United States. The result is that the culture of Denmark and of Sweden, which are themselves very distinctive, are not as pluralistic as one gets in either the UK or the US. And in their very different ways, the countries seem in some ways less individualistic than are Britain or the US. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. All that I'm saying is that depending on what the background of people is, what their ideas are, what their expectations are, there may be certain kind of things that you can do quite easily in one place, which if you were going to get people to comply with them and to behave in that manner elsewhere, might require a whole lot of rather different kinds of work. If this is right, and I may well not be right, it doesn't mean that we may not be able to learn from one another. But what it is open to them to do just as things stand may be different from what it's open to us to do, unless one tries to make considerable changes to our motivation, our traditions, or our expectations. It isn't impossible, but it might mean that in achieving certain kind of things, or in having institutions work in a particular way, someone in Britain trying to accomplish this may face problems in trying to institute the kind of arrangement, say, that there are in Sweden or in Denmark behind particular measures, may face problems of a kind that they don't, and vice versa. Something similar may be the case also if one compares societies which are strongly tribal in their character. There may there be strong ethical attachments which simply are different to the kind of ethos of a more universalistic kind within a particular country, which one takes for granted if one is thinking about issues of institutional design in the UK, say. The other kind of constraint is that exercised upon us as acting individuals by institutions and social phenomena, which are the products of and are sustained by the actions of individuals in the society in which we're living. I'm not concerned here with just the specific institutional setting in which we may be acting, but by the way in which societies and phenomena within them may have a distinctive thing-like character which constrains us. If we wish to buy something, say some apples, we'll discover that at any one time and place, the apples have a particular price, which itself is an emergent product of the actions of other individuals in a particular institutional setting. And this then constrains what we can do. It constrains what's available, and where what the constraints are on us may clearly be different in different settings. Similarly, in any particular society, there'll be certain opportunities for employment relating to the economic structure of the society. There will be certain limited opportunities for people to be appointed as chief financial officers for companies, or to become professional footballers. Clearly, we may innovate and create new opportunities, or the structure of the economy may change. But at any one point, these things may face us, much as, say, trees might if we were to walk through a woodland. We just kind of have to see these things there and walk round them if we're not going to hit into them and experience difficulties. The same is true concerning our institutions as such. In the notes to a previous lecture, I referred to Pressman and Wildavsky's brilliant and thought-provoking study, Implementation. This discussed how it was that reforms that it was broadly agreed by everyone were desirable didn't actually take place, just because for them to occur would have required that various different government agencies took actions which there was no reason for them to undertake. It was not that these people were misbehaving so much as that they had tasks to perform on the various rules, on the basis of various rules and procedures, which didn't include them doing the sort of things that would have been needed in order to bring about the broadly desired result. It wasn't that they were being obstructive, it was more that their days and their work responsibilities were structured by this stuff, which then meant that certain kind of things which would have been needed to bring about these generally agreed to be desirable results just didn't happen. The problem here is one which I've discussed elsewhere, illustrating it with the issue of someone such as myself trying to lose weight. Let's just say there may be some large-scale goal which is attractive, but where the problem is that for it actually to be achieved, one would need to break it down into sub-goals which relate directly to actions that one and others can and will be motivated to perform. If this can't be done, setting oneself as an individual or as an organization, such a goal really is futile. Now, clearly, in some cases, what may be needed is to change routines so that following them will then achieve the macro level goal. All that one needs to do is to make sure that there is appropriate motivation at the micro level, as it were, to actually do what you need to do so that it adds up to accomplishing this large-scale outcome. In other cases, we may find that there's no alternative to doing things to achieve one goal, which would also allow one to accomplish others. And this indeed was the thrust of Hayek's argument concerning our need to use markets in a large, sophisticated economy. and that their performing the functions we need them to do is incompatible with their also generating outcomes which are, in quotation marks, socially just. Let me move from that back to another key theme in Popper. In The Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper offered a theory of explanation in which material ideas about what an explanation has to look like, for example, compliance with a specific metaphysics, were over time, he argued, replaced, and for good reasons, by purely logical and methodological requirements. He has a good discussion of this in his The Bucket and the Searchlight, in his Objective Knowledge. What an explanation should consist of there, he argues, is that you need to have a universal law and initial conditions from which a statement of what you want to explain can be deduced, and also that the universal laws and initial conditions, those statements of those things, can be tested, and where ideally you'd want those things to be true. And indeed, in an explanation, one wants, if one's putting up things which are going to explain other things, one wants them to be independently testable, to be tested and pass the tests, and, as I indicated, ideally also to be true. Now, Popper extended this approach also to history, but he was somewhat ambivalent concerning what he said about laws in this context. In The Open Society, he did talk about social laws, but he also discussed forms of explanation which rest on the so-called rationality principle. And later in Models, Instruments, and Truth, and in an interview on historical explanation, which is now located in After the Open Society, he explained that in history, he took the view that what played a key role was really rationality rather than substantive universal laws. Although he'd also argue that there may be typically uninteresting universal laws assumed in the background. For example, such things as that if a king's head is cut off, he dies, or something of this kind. Now, Popper, in his critique of historicism, argued against universal laws of historical development. He argued that this was an unfruitful kind of thing to look for. But what other laws were there? Well, in some cases, they were just generalizations. For example, that if two armies of comparable strength but vastly different sizes were engaged under generals of similar capacities, one just assumes that the larger one will win. This, though, seems to me a bad move to make, for in such cases, I'd have thought what matters is the specific battle and what was going on there, rather than what happens in similar cases. Why? Well, there's not on the face of it any depth to the generalization that's being appealed to. One might here go back to our discussions in earlier lectures of the contrast between accidentally true generalizations and ones which we really see as laws. In the latter case, where falling into a particular group, we take to actually mean that something then has to have the property in question. Accordingly, I'd suggest that we see what's involved, as in this army case, as offering a general statement about what's relevant in a particular case, where if it's questioned, we look not at some putative universal law, which we test using other examples, but we take it rather to be a signal to look at the individual case in more detail. There are other cases which look different, which Popper discusses. For example, we do indeed presume that if someone's head is cut off, he dies. And here we are in the course of our narrative invoking a universal law, but it's hardly a historical law. What else might we use? I'm not sure about laws from other areas in the social sciences, but I think it's not implausible to say that, for example, if the government is simply printing some fiat currency to meet its bills, that's to say we've got a currency like the pound sterling, the only security behind which is the is our trust in the government, as it were, God help us, then in the case of a government simply printing a lot of this currency to meet its bills, we can appeal to a general relationship which economists can tell us about how such behavior results in inflation. And I think in such cases, it's indeed possible that we may be looking to universal laws. And one might indeed look at other cases to see if one actually has the suggested mechanism right. And one does there, I think, have to offer an account of a causal mechanism which explains why the sort of result which one's appealing to is necessitated. But in line with my earlier argument, I do think that we can usefully refer in such cases both to individual action and to structures, which may or may not be in place in particular historical circumstances. I tend to be inclined to say that we typically have to look at the individual case in more depth if there is a problem about our initial explanation, although here, as distinct from the battle case, there may be more of a genuine contribution from theory, which can properly be tested in other cases, not least because we are here making claims about the unintended consequences of an action about which the agents may well be in ignorance, and also about structures, which are the products of and are maintained by individual action, which may be in place in a particular setting in which we're operating. But if one makes such points, I think this contrasts a bit with what Popper in his earlier writings on these things seemed to be saying about the role of universal laws. In saying these things, it's not clear that what I'm arguing for differs from Popper's views as much as might seem to be the case. For, as I've already indicated, if one looks at his models, instruments, and truth in the method of framework, and also at his historical explanation and interview in After the Open Society, what Popper stresses isn't universal laws, but the use of the rationality principle, that's to say an individual-based rational action model, with individuals acting in social situations, and the rationality serving the same formal role in explanation as a law would in an explanation in the natural or social sciences. I'll say more about this in my next lecture on the philosophy of social science. Next, concerning history, there is the problem of selection. At the start of the final chapter of the Open Society, Popper poses the problem of the influence of our theories about the world on what we select and what gets confirmed. As to confirmation, Popper obviously mentions that his own emphasis on falsification rather than just getting positive instances of things. He also removes what would otherwise be a problem. That's to say that seeing the facts in terms of particular theories might it be claimed just lead to their confirmation. But you can clearly systematically describe things in terms of a particular theory, but if one says how specifically they're supposed to behave, one's conjecture may be refuted just because things as so described don't in fact behave on the kind of basis that one was indicating. For Popper, something only counts as a confirmation if it was the result of an attempt at refutation or can be seen as such. There is, however, a bigger problem about selection, what do we study? For Popper, there are, in general terms, two answers to this question. First, he places emphasis upon our problems, which may be practical, or they may be the result of problems, empirical or theoretical, with our prior theories. Second, he stresses the role that's played by our theories themselves. He contrasts in, for example, the bucket and the searchlight in Objective Knowledge, the empiricist bucket theory of the mind and the kind of semi-Kantian searchlight theory of the mind which he favors, which sees our attention and questioning of the world as being directed by our theories. Our searchlights for Popper are typically our theories. However, if one takes the view that there are not deep structural theories in history and the social sciences that inform it, then we're left with what Popper, here quoting Schopenhauer, referred to as an infinite subject matter. And this theme, Popper quotes Schopenhauer on, but it is also something which affected neo-Kantian philosophical discussions of history in the latter part of the 19th century. People writing about the character of history were much concerned with this problem, as was Max Weber. The issue indeed is discussed in Rickert and following Rickert in Max Weber. Popper argues that, given the role that he accords to laws in history, these don't in themselves give us a point of view in the light of which we can make selections within the myriad of our potential subject matter. Popper mentions the role here that may be played by what he calls general interpretations of history. For example, you may have approaches which stress the role of great men, or of chance or accident, or of economic factors in history. And such approaches can, in some respects, direct us as to what we should be looking for and what kind of relationships we should be trying out. Popper, though, is concerned because these things don't seem to be testable in the way in which theories in physics or in areas of the social sciences are. That's to say, we may be confronted, if we're writing history, with there being only a limited amount of evidence, and it may be compatible with all our theories, and there may also be problems about the pre-selection of evidence. I was reading a book recently which gives quite an interesting account of the behavior of the early Christians and their attitudes towards the classical world, which in broad terms put them up there with the Taliban in terms of simple destruction of anything that seems at odds with their views. And so there were people who wrote at great length against Christianity, of whose views we know almost nothing because their books were destroyed or no copies were made of them and so on. In a similar kind of way, around the Mediterranean area, all sorts of artworks which depicted the classical gods were defaced and destroyed by strongly motivated Christians. And a consequence of this is that one may be operating in an area where the only theories around are difficult to criticize just because the stuff which you might have hoped to have recourse to take issue with them is no longer available to the historian. On Popper's account, there is some room for the assessment of interpretations of history. One can ask, do they actually fit the evidence? Or to what extent, in giving an account of the evidence, do they depend on problematic ad hoc assumptions? But if there is a genuine possibility of counterexamples, they may get nearer to the status of a scientific hypothesis. One may alternatively see these things as being, as it were, crystallizations of points of view, in which context they're not necessarily at odds with one another in the history that they produce, because the different points of view just pick out different things to study. To give an obvious example, a Muslim historian, a Christian historian, and an atheist historian may be interested in different things that happened in the past, as indeed might a feminist or an anti-feminist, a socialist or an anti-socialist. So while they have different perspectives, what interests them is different, and they may just end up telling different stories. These concerns may simply lead them to select different things for study. Also, each generation has its own problems, interests, and point of view. And Popper in the Open Society seems to accept that it's perfectly okay for people to write history from that perspective. He writes, in the Open Society, the main thing is to be conscious of one's point of view and critical, and avoid uncritical bias in the presentation of the facts. However, there's some obvious problems here. First, we may well not be conscious of our point of view. While in broad terms, I personally don't think much of postmodernism, one important issue raised by postmodernists has been the degree to which people in the past haven't been aware of the fact that they had a distinctive and indeed possibly problematic point of view. What about objectivity? Popper's own theory of objectivity depends crucially upon intersubjective criticism. In history, there seem to me two kinds of problem in this taking place. First of all, insofar as perspectives and interpretations are value-based, a real difficulty may be that the only people who are interested in working in the areas in question are people who share the values that constitute the area of study in question. Others may just have no interest in it, or may simply find the whole thing rather distasteful. For example, labor history of a certain kind seems to have been constituted by way of a particular kind of socialist value orientation. Women's history typically by feminists, gay history by people who are interested in gay liberation, and the history of transsexuality by people who are transsexual or strongly supportive of such an attitude. There is a problem just because their work is typically not going to be challenged by people with other value orientations. First, it's not clear that these other people will have any interest in working in these fields at all. I mean, if people have an aversion to gay liberation, for example, it's not likely that they're going to choose, when they could be doing other things, to spend their time discussing the history of gay sensibilities through history. They may not be interested in these issues, and they may indeed find dealing with their subject matter positively unattractive. Well, they may also find that they and their work, if they do undertake it in these areas, are strongly resented by people who are partisans and who largely constitute the field. It's striking, for example, the kind of hostility that academic critics of theories of so-called gender identity theory have encountered, regardless of what their own personal political or ethical orientation might have been. That's to say, one has an area of work being constituted by people with a particular value orientation who tend really to give a very hostile reception to anyone who raises questions about what they've been doing if they are not gung-ho for the underlying perspective. Issues here may to a degree be self-adjusting, just in the sense that if huge reputations are made in some field, then there may be gains to its effective criticism. But this, it seems to me, can typically be undertaken only by senior people who have work which is in some way already also related to the field, it would not, say, make much sense for an able young person who was critical of the values underlying gay history and the work to which it had led. For example, an able young conservative evangelical Christian or a young conservative Muslim to try to specialize in that field. I mean, if they did, they might be able to score some very effective points. They might indeed get published and get quite a bit of attention. What isn't so clear is whether they would actually be able to get a job anywhere after having done that. The other kind of problem to which Popper alludes is that there may simply be insufficient data to allow for the effective testing of historical explanations. Sometimes such testing might happen. For example, the philosopher and historian R.G. Collingwood did some interesting work on the Roman occupation of Britain. And one of the things that he wrote about was Hadrian's Wall, and this is a quite impressive stone wall which runs just to the south of where I'm currently living in Dumfries, which served effectively to separate northern England from Scotland. And people were asking, okay, this wall was constructed, but what did they do with it? I mean, how was it used? And there were different theories being put forward about what the military use of this wall might have been. And Collingwood made some conjectures about this, on the basis of which he said, look, if I'm right, the wall must actually extend beyond the areas in which it's currently known to exist. It must actually continue, I think, towards the sea in the west, where it wasn't known that there were any remnants of this. And indeed, more wall was found. And so Collingwood's view seems to have been corroborated. But more typically, you're just not going to have available data of this kind, with the result that history may, in a certain sense, amount to a set of conflicting interpretations. Something well worth considering is then on just what basis is one historical account to be preferred to another. Evidence is important, so presumably is coherence in the story, and also the ability to pose telling questions for competing views. But it would be well worth explicating these things, and if one's a critical rationalist, comparing them with the kinds of methodological ideas which are suggested in Popper's work. All this, I think, poses an interesting problem for Popper's approach, for you may recall that his view was that the origins of our ideas don't matter. Look again at On the Sources of Knowledge in Conjectures, because rather than going back and asking what's the origin of the ideas and is it based on telling evidence, what you can do is have people put forward their interpretations and critically scrutinize them from different perspectives. But with regard to history, this may face some limits, and it might well be worth thinking about a view, just by way of contrast, which is very different from Popper's. It was developed within Islam, where there was a concern for the accuracy of the accounts of the sayings and the actions of the Prophet, which are taken as giving Muslims authoritative guidance as to how they should behave. In this context, there was developed a distinctive approach, often referred to as Hadith methodology or Im-il Rijal, but I don't know if I got the pronunciation of that right. The idea was that one should, as it were, trace the genealogy of reports about the Prophet and discover, if someone made such a report, where they were supposed to have got the information from. And questions were then posed as to whether, say, ideas were testified to independently from different sources. and also where you know how the ideas were transmitted, whether the chains of transmission were in fact good. And it looks to me as if there were developed in this literature some interesting ideas about how likely it was that particular sources were reliable, or the degree of reliability that accounts might have, depending on what sort of sources there were for them. If I'm right about this, a scholar with good Arabic and Persian might wish to compare this material with the material critically surveyed in a book like Ian Hacking's The Emergence of Probability, in which he looks at the gradual development of different notions of probability and evidential support in the West. There was also in the Muslim material a concern not just for the quality of the links, that's to say, was it possible or likely that one person could in fact have got the information from the person whom it was claimed was the origin of it, and so on. But in addition, it was asked, were the people of good moral reputation? One person was classified as unreliable because when someone who was sent out to check up on him arrived at his property, the person was found trying to attract a domestic animal to him by pretending that he had food in it, in a bucket, as it were. And it was concluded, if this man would cheat an animal, then surely he didn't have the kind of character that was required for the reliable transmission of the report on the doings or sayings of the prophet. Now, I'm not advocating that this should be adopted. What I am saying is it is an interesting response to a problem of how do you deal with issues about the accuracy of historical reports when independent testing isn't possible. And I think that critical rationalists might find it stimulating to look at this material and to consider, well, would they go along with this? Or if not, what kind of approach might they suggest one took? The approach offers an interesting contrast to Popper's. In the institutional setting in which it was developed, it may have a certain validity. Why? Well, in particular, because there was a tradition of making sure that people were word perfect about such things before they were entitled to pass them on. And there's a tradition both for this and for the entitlement to teach a particular religious commentary, for the instructor in it, in effect, to license his pupil only when he's satisfied that the pupil's knowledge of the material was sufficiently good. And if one has such a personal tradition and a tradition of personal endorsement, then in that setting, going and tracking how these things worked and whether there was an appropriate chain might then be quite interesting. However, there's been much controversy about such matters, for example, in respect of whether certain traditions concerning the prophet hadn't perhaps been invented in order to resolve problems that arose after his death. And some Western scholars particularly have taken such a view, and as a result are somewhat skeptical about the claims of many of the Hadith to authenticity. But there are arguments back and forth about this. By contrast, some traditional Muslim scholars take Hadith methodology as actually resolving these issues. So, conclusions. Be all this as it may, there are clearly some interesting issues about what happens to Popper's approach when it's applied to history. We seem to hit problems about the role of values in constituting areas of scholarship. The picture from Popper is essentially one like the one gets in Max Weber, in which values partly constitute subject matter from the potentially infinite subject matter of history. They enable us to pick out specific things as being worth study, but in which the objectivity which one might hope for relating to such study might be called into question if there's a lack of diversity and a lack of testability. And it seems to me particularly disturbing that in America currently, there's a growing tendency for professors in the humanities and the social sciences to be Democrats rather than Republicans. The issue isn't about the substance of their views so much as the lack of critical scrutiny of their work by people with different value orientations. However, I would stress to claim that I don't wish my own understanding of Popper's work in this area has any particular status. I'm well aware, for example, on issues relating to the partly social interpretation of methodological rules that I favor, that I'm advancing ideas which aren't to be found in Popper's work, and which I suspect he would have disliked, although if he disliked them, that's not the same as their being wrong. While David Miller, who worked particularly closely with Popper, in addition to specializing in work on issues on which I'm completely clueless, would, I think, in some respects, give a very different view of things than do I. And I think it might be very tempting to see whether he could at some point be prompted into giving some general lectures about Popper's philosophical ideas. Let me call a halt to this and let me open things to criticism. Any criticisms, any requests for explanations? I can't see all of the squares, so could you put up a hand? Philip.
Okay, so largely because no one else did. I didn't want you.
No, it's fine.
Okay, a couple of things. I mean, I think many of your criticisms of current social science and history practices may have some merit, but I was rather struck by the broad sweep of you categorize labor history in particular and women's history as part of an area of academia that tends to be only populated by people who already have value commitments and are not open to contestation. Labor history in particular, it seems to me, is remarkably more likely to attract critiques, possibly because someone can remain in another field, for example, of history, and critique the labor historians because there is an overlap, there is an intersection, and it seems to me that there are indeed in every one of the fields that you have mentioned intersections with, let's say, political history or economic history, etc. But labor history in particular has, which you held up as an example of a value-laden or value-committed field of study, has received significant critiques from individuals who are not necessarily partisans in the advance of labor, I think.
Can I comment quickly just on that? Look, I'm sorry, there are two separate issues there. First of all, I was saying that the business of picking out a particular field as an object of study typically looks like something that is value constituted. So if one looks at the origins of labor history as an enterprise, this seems to me to have typically been undertaken by people who were socialists. Second, I would agree 100% that people, for example, who are established figures in related fields can and do make interventions. My point about it was to say that if you have an able young scholar starting out, while they might indeed be able to make quite a splash by way of offering criticism, their difficulty is typically then to get an academic appointment, if that is what they've done. And so I'm not saying that these things are, I mean, it's not an absolute matter, But I guess what I'm saying is that if one has, as Popper does, a conception of objectivity where one sees it as being a matter of critical dialogue, then I think that there can be a substantive problem in this sort of area. And
So Jeremy, do you mind if I come back in? I mean,
no,
I broadly agree with most of what you're saying, but I think there are, the interesting thing is that you're making this comment as a comment on the status of history and historical studies, and it strikes me that in order for there to be controversy and critical dialogue, you have to have a second point of view first developed. And the second point of view that is developed, in contrast to the orthodox field or the mainstream field, often in its formative steps, is indeed carried by those most committed and most interested, both materially and intellectually, in a particular field of study. So yes, in its infancy, almost every field of study that is newly established or subfield will be made up of partisans of that field, but it doesn't remain that way. If I may suggest that, the one thing about your observation on the writing of history or the commentary of history is that it's, so to speak, you're conflating history as an ongoing activity and history in new fields at its infancy. So there's almost a lack of historical sense to the development of the historical interpretations. As a field matures, it attracts criticism from an intersection with adjacent fields, so that persons who are pursuing diplomatic history or political history or economic history or business history will intersect, for example, with, amongst other things, labor history, will intersect with women's history. These are not ultimately fields that will not have comment from, and this includes new scholars in those fields. So it strikes me almost itself to be a partisan point on your part, if you don't mind my suggesting that there is something wrong in a field in its infancy being largely supported by partisans in that field and not available for criticism. It seems to me, in fact, a prerequisite almost for there to be critical dialogue. There must be a brief period in which almost there is a nurturing and almost an immunization to a very short moment of the new theory, so that it can establish its own credible anchorage. So that's really what I wanted to raise.
What I'd say is this. I mean, my own view is very strongly one which favors a competitive pluralism of different research agendas, in which context, it seems to me, support for a particular perspective from other people, if you like, a degree of sheltering is fine. I guess what I would say is that I have been very struck by, I mean, let me give a couple of examples. There was a controversy about whether or not the Industrial Revolution was bad for working people. And I mean, there was quite a long tradition of writing of different kinds by people who were broadly socialist in their sympathies, who took up one or other variety of this kind of view. And there were obviously differences between them, in the sense that there were issues about whether people were objectively more miserable than they were in the countryside, whether actually it's wrong to think of this in terms of material impoverishment as opposed to a sort of spiritual and cultural impoverishment, and so on and so on. What I found quite striking was that you did get a certain explicit opposition to this view being canvassed in the middle of the 20th century. But it seems to me that people who are explicitly taking up views critical of such approaches tend now to be rather thin on the ground. And where I would say that there seems to me to have been a kind of shift towards a reluctance to appoint people who might take views that are critical of such a thing to academic positions. And all I'm saying is, while I fully agree with you that an established figure from a related area may, as it were, make a sally in that area, and that is, there's only there's a certain limit with regard to that, where it seems to me that over time, the degree to which there is a genuine contrast of value perspectives permitted within the academic world is decreasing. And it seems to me that as a consequence, there is as it were, I mean, if I'm right, there is an epistemological come sociological problem facing a Popperian approach to these things, just on the grounds that while indeed if you have an area in which there really isn't much self-criticism at all, you could say that it's ripe for someone to have a go at it. It equally isn't going to be particularly fruitful if anyone wanting to do research in that area is then likely to find that they face the equivalent of public persecution as a heretic for having dared to do so.
No, I mean, I am aware of the controversies, and I'm aware of the movement, for example, for the heterodox academy and things of that nature that has taken root in the United States. So I'm not unsympathetic or not unaware of the positions that you are advancing, but I also want to make a point, which perhaps is that in the infancy of those subfields, those new subfields, effectively there needs to be a brief period in which there is a sheltered and more partisan perspective. I think your reference to the Industrial Revolution and its impact on working class incomes is well put, but unlike you, my understanding is that there are now many approaches that criticize the socialist contentions that were originally advanced in the labor history field, and that it do indeed point to a rather different outcome early on from the Industrial Revolution. I'm not sure that those ultimately are compelling, by the way, and part of the reason for explaining the lack of senior academics in those fields might actually be that their research ultimately has not been quite as convincing to the general readership of historians. But let me, I think we probably exhausted that topic.
Yes, although could I just offer one clarification? I mean, I am not saying this is definitively the case. What I am saying is, to the degree to which if the field of history is one which has of necessity to be in some ways value constituted, there is a general theoretical problem here. And I don't myself have a particular view about what the substance of the matter might be like. I'm just saying that if one looks at this in methodological terms, a kind of Popperian approach to objectivity does really require that different perspectives can be explored and engaged critically. And it seems to me that there are some signs of a bad shift in academia in this regard.
Right. Well, one other point, and then I'll give way.
Margarita is
so the other point is just you made reference to Popper's view and on the sources of knowledge paper, and that was in the 1953 paper. He does actually on page 23, I find, make a distinction between sources of historical knowledge and the need to continuously go back to origins and original sources. There, it's the one thing where he distinguishes that from the scientific interest, not in the origins, but in current debate. Not to eyewitnesses, obviously, but to other sources.
I take the point, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that in that area, there is an issue for people interested in Popper's work. I mean, namely, that if one takes intersubjective criticism and concern for origins as being the broad Popperian account, one really needs, as an alternative, the development of what a Popperian approach to historiography might then look like.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I will let Margareta go, so I'll silence myself. Thank you.
Jeremy, so when I listened towards the end, I think that somehow three different issues got mixed up. One is we are in the middle of an evolution. Dus there is like change, and it can be for the better, it can be progress, but it can also be regressive. So it is change. Then number two is rhetoric. Dus what I think, this is something that Popper didn't talk about explicitly, dus the connection with literary criticism and what is going on in the English department, dus that there is a study of rhetoric and really acknowledge the different ways of criticizing. And so then we get to dus there are some very good ways of criticizing, but there are also very bad and manipulative ways of criticizing. And so then I would like to point out the third item is that there is, and Popper acknowledges that himself, that, and actually Popper maybe is a little wishy-washy on that, dus that there is a tendency in society to push this simplified way of thinking that there are only two positions, like the good ones and the bad ones. And I heard you, dus that is especially advanced in the United States. Dus the Republicans are the good ones and the Democrats are the bad ones, or the Democrats are the good ones and the Republicans are the bad ones. And in rhetoric, it has been identified as the argument as war. Dus that the purpose of an argument is to show that I'm right and whoever disagrees with me is wrong. And so Popper is really giving us an alternative way, that is say when we criticize, we need to do it in the form of you may be right, I may be wrong, and together we get to the truth. And so this what I'm trying to say is that in the English departments, like starting, and I know personally, I should say, because I was at Purdue University where there was a lot of investment in rhetoric, they were trying to teach, dus at Purdue University, all the engineers, everyone, how to criticize each other properly. So there was this very positive movement, very Popperian, to teach one another to think critically. And I think in England, the UK, that was also in the debating societies. But then we got like a backlash, and the backlash was the simplified way of reasoning that it's all postmodernism. So there was this huge attack on the English departments, that it was all nonsense that was coming out of there, and that they were relativist and postmodernist. And so then people resorted back to the simplified way of criticizing without fully understanding There's all the multiple dimensions, and so what we see in the United States, that is also something maybe you know or you don't know, that has been pointing out philosophical history. There's only the philosophers know something about it, and even then they tend to know more about analytical philosophy than about continental philosophy. So the sense of the historical thinking is here not necessarily guaranteed to be sophisticated enough to go beyond this us versus them reasoning. So I think that is something that needs to be acknowledged, that there is a simplified way of thinking that somehow is taking over the academy. And so it's not the Republicans versus the Democrats, it's the simplified thinking versus the more sophisticated thinking.
Okay.
And that is something we need to talk about. Why did this regression happen, and what can we do to make it, to overcome it?
Okay. I agree. I think myself that there's been, I mean, I tend to think that a lot of the ideas influencing people who's in the US who see themselves as conservatives are idiotic. I also personally think that postmodernism and post-structuralism are badly defective. And I would be overjoyed if the academic Marxists, the genuine ones, actually retook the intellectual left, because with them, it is certainly possible for people who disagree with them actually to engage in useful critical exchanges. But I think myself that well, I'll talk about this in the second series, but it just seems to me that the kind of thinking which has become dominant in a lot of academia is idealist in a bad sense, in the sense that people have kind of lost sight of the realities of the social world and have become somehow beguiled into thinking that all that is needed is somehow to change people, how people think about things, or the words or terms that people are using. And Marx himself gave what seems to me to be a really telling critique of exactly this sort of attitude on the part of the of some of his former associates amongst the young Hegelians. And I mean, I personally find that there was I mean, it's not that a lot of good work has not been done. I mean, I've been reading a book just recently, which has been concerned with the education of young Hasidic Jewish women. And the person who wrote this, which I think is a very good and interesting study, has been influenced by Foucault. But despite that, as it were, she's nonetheless written a very good book. But I mean, Foucault, in some ways, for me, almost epitomizes the problem that he just made various kinds of proclamations. There's no consistency through his work, and that the intellectual degeneration from the serious academic Marxists to people who've been to a lot of the people who've been influenced by him, especially in English departments, is so sad that I'm, you know, it becomes difficult to know quite how to address it. But I would agree. I mean, all I was trying to suggest was that figures that I've seen recently about US academics' political affiliations have pushed the spread towards the Democrats much further than it was. And all I was saying is, well, to the degree to which one needs critical interaction between people taking different perspectives, this seems to me to be something that's regrettable.
Yeah. So to amplify some of the things that I said, or what I said myself, Popper makes this distinction between the third descriptive and the fourth argumentative function. And so I think that is really in the middle. We are in the middle of this evolution in our thinking to say, yeah, we need to pay attention to that argumentative function. And that is what I meant by the regression, that because people
Yes,
didn't get their
I
Popper.
agree.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
said I agreed.
Yeah, no, I just want to clear the air, so to say. But then I also wanted to really point out that this whole argument about this whatever academics being democratic and so that started as some sort of a scientific argument in the early 2000s, I guess, and now people have been beating the drum, and it's kind of a simple way of thinking, but in the United States apparently it's very attractive because it is simple. So you keep on pushing the idea that the Democrats are a monolithic way of thinking for the young and the naive, and then when you're older, then you become a Republican or a conservative, and then they set up, and the Americans, as far as I can know, they totally get played by whoever gave him that argument. And so that I think, so that's why I'm in this conference, actually, in the hope that to find more Popperians to kind of
Yes.
show there is a way to totally transcend
Yes,
this sort
but,
of thinking.
sorry,
Yeah.
what I tried to explain was, given Popper's own theory about objectivity, moving to objectivity requires that there are people around with different perspectives. And to the degree to which there seems to be reasonably systematically a shift in one direction, this may pose some issues. It's not a matter of saying, you know, Republicans right, Democrats wrong, or whatever. It's purely a matter of saying, if you have a theory of objectivity which sees objectivity as a product of a friendly, hostile contention between people who take different systematic perspectives, then you need to have opportunities for people to be there who can take those perspectives.
Yeah, and so that was why I brought up the field of rhetoric, because I think it's a little more complicated than saying there is a shift in one direction. It's more that people don't know anymore how to argue because discourses in rhetoric have not been taken serious enough and been dropped at the expense of other work. So that there is enough diversity in the United States in the thinking, but it's really about how to express it in a friendly engagement.
Okay.
And instead, and what you brought up about Foucault was very relevant. The way I've read Foucault and some comments on his work is that he decided to treat society as some sort of machine. I mean, for lack of better word, where like everything is like this, it's all like a big machine, which is totally consistent with French rationalism of Descartes, so to say. And so he really pushed it in every possible direction that he could. And then at the end of his life, he decided it didn't really work and
Well,
didn't really give insight. But meanwhile, all these naive followers amplified the paradigm and now we've stuck with it and we need to get rid of it.
Well, I'll talk a bit about that in substantive terms in the next series of lectures, assuming anyone wants to attend them. I had Ali Pear, who was wanting to get in.
Well, thank you so much. I don't take your time too much.
No.
This
time is available for discussion.
Because I think the time is already gone.
No, it's fine. We've got until 9. So.
All right, good. Very, very quick comment concerning the notion of laws in history and in social science.
Of what?
The notion of laws.
I missed the. What's
perhaps,
the term?
Law, L-A-W.
Laws.
The notion of laws in history and social science. David Miller has a paper, I'm not sure whether he has published it or not, in which he argues that there are no laws in social sciences. That seems to be the case in history and apart from natural sciences, which we do have laws. In other sciences, the notion of laws seems to be problematic. Now, with respect to history and other social sciences, there is a way, and I remember we discussed this earlier, there is a logical way in which you can contrapose singular statements concerning specific events in history into general, perhaps even universal statements. Now, in this way, history and social sciences would become, if you like, a very fruitful source of information, because as I mentioned, each singular statement could be transposed into universal claim, and that universal claim could be used by people in different places and in different times. Now, any comment on that?
Well, can you tell me more concretely?
I can give you one specific or many specific examples. If you like.
Just one, so that I can see what the idea is.
I just give you one. Now, suppose we come across this particular singular statement that this particular dictatorial regime, despite the fact that it was enjoying a powerful army, could not resist the force of people and collapse. Okay, this is a singular statement concerning a particular regime in a specific space-time. Now, with a simple logical, if you like, trick or procedure, you can transpose this singular statement into a universal general statement. So we can say it is not the case that for all dictatorial regimes who enjoy support of powerful armies, that they could resist the force of people and they could stay in power forever. Now, this, if you like, logical trick could be applied to all singular statements, and in that way, every information which is valid could be turned into a universal, inspirational, if you like, claim concerning either history or in other disciplines of social sciences. Okay, so that was my comment. So now I wonder whether you do have any opinion.
I'm baffled as to why anyone, I mean, as to what you might think would be gained by this. I mean, let's put it this way. Yeah. It certainly is I mean, if we're dealing with a specific concrete situation, it certainly may be the case that you specify what you understand to have happened there. And someone might say, well, that is surely not right, because here is another example of cases where those things were happening and you didn't get that outcome. Okay, so I can see that from that point of view, critical comparison by way of trying to describe something in general terms could be useful, but I would have thought that what we are going to be wanting to do in that kind of case is to go back and look in more detail at the particular situation in our first example, and to try to bring out further of the details that were involved in that. I mean, I just don't think that in the social sciences, it's plausible that there is something like natural necessity of a kind which I think has to underlie any good explanation in the natural sciences. On the other hand, there may be issues about mechanisms, for example, about what underlies inflation or a trade cycle, or what kind of things have to happen if succession of rule or influence within a particular group is involved, but where to get to something which would really have a law-like status would require the kind of thing that's involved as being more like the inflation or trade cycle case, rather than something that is just going to push us back to the more detailed description of the concrete particular situation.
Yeah, may I very briefly come back to what you said, and then I leave the floor to others. What I suggested was basically using a logical procedure, which is quite valid. It is being used in logic everywhere. By using that, you can transpose the information which is limited into a particular situation into some sort of universal set of information. Although, because it is universal, it is not definite. It applies to, if you like, a generalized scenario. So in the example which I mentioned, you transpose the information concerning one particular specific incident into some sort of general lesson from history. That general lesson.
Yeah. But I can't understand why you think doing that would be of the slightest use or interest. I mean, it just seems to me, a point. As I mean, I may have misunderstood you, but I just can't understand the point of doing such.
If history is there to teach us not to repeat the mistakes of those who have been before us, then this mechanism, if you like, this procedure would help us with a very powerful tool, instrument, in order to glean lessons out of history.
Well, so I'm not sure that I'm not sure I'd agree that history has anything to do with lessons. I mean, I take history to be more about what happened. I mean, we can clearly look to see.
Sorry to interrupt you. Is it not the case that we could learn from the mistakes of those who were living in the past and try not to repeat that? That is a good lesson. That is the only lesson, actually.
Well, let's put it this way. Just because what happened in the past typically happens in circumstances that are different from those which we're living in now, will be living in the future, I think that we have to be a bit careful. It certainly is the case that one might say there is a particular kind of problem that came up. So, for example, you know, a political party was committed to a general program, but didn't try and work out before they got into power what this might actually mean and expose it to criticism and so on, so that maybe there's a lesson we can learn from that. Yeah. But I think that is not a matter, I mean, we may want to go back and look selectively at bits of history in that context, but that is not actually writing the history as such. I mean, that we're concerned there with a policy problem.
Okay, I'll stop here. We will continue this 12 minutes. Okay, thank you so much.
I've got Luke next and then Philip.
Just a small remark, because I remember that Popper often wrote at several places that we should never be under the illusion that we have lost all our prejudices. And this is a very dangerous thing to think so. And I think that's a very nice
Sorry,
idea.
your voice was cut off. So could you please repeat what you said?
You didn't hear me?
No, I didn't.
Because Popper wrote at several places, I think, that we should never be under the illusion that we have lost all our prejudices. You understand me now?
Yeah, true, of course. I agree.
Yes, and that there is no procedure to do this. We can try to help it by interact with people who had a different kind of education, who come from a different culture and so on. But we should never be under the illusion that we have lost all our prejudices, of course. And there are some examples in history, even about intelligent people who, and that we can realize only later, when we have lost our prejudice, that we had one, even that we don't realize that we have prejudice. And this is a very good idea, I think, that we should always keep in mind.
No, I mean, you're surely right.
Yes.
All I would say is that does have then, in effect, a sociological element to it, which seems to me to suggest that we should investigate the possibilities of cultivating almost a multifaceted pluralism in educational institutions, so that different perspectives can be cultivated and can learn from one another. And I certainly think that, I mean, my concern was not to push any particular political barrow, so much as to say I've become concerned that things seem to be shifting in a particular direction. And I'd say more generally, I mean, I am not a religious person. I think that the freedom for people to develop their religious views, to work on these, to transmit them, to educate their kids within a particular religious perspective, and different ones are vitally important for all of us. And I think we're just moving towards a situation of increased intolerance, where people don't recognize the legitimacy from a methodological point of view of people taking up research programs which are different in their orientations from ones which they favor. And particularly, say, on religious matters, you can't prove that there doesn't exist a God. You can't prove that he didn't require of people to do all sorts of things which, in my view, are completely daft. But given that that is the case, one should surely tolerate people who have different views. But at the same time, I think they need then to face what empirical information one has about difficulties that their approach has hit in the past, and so have to be asked, okay, if you're going to pursue this perspective, how are you going to deal with these kinds of issues? And I mean, this, in my view, is what we need across the board. And it's only from exposing ourselves to the ideas of people who take different views, reading what they've got to say, talking with them, that we can indeed discover our own errors and prejudices. 100% agreement.
Now it's time for Philip.
Okay, Philip.
Thank you. Sorry to come back for a second. I think Popper recognized that we need history that provides us with multiple stories and stories that will help us explain our position in the world. So although it's not prescriptive of future development, we have great use for history. We need history. But the other area that we need history and perhaps can learn from history, as Ali was saying, I think is in the area perhaps of precaution. You can indeed see certain developments that have led to either disaster or at least the unintended consequences that we perhaps would not desire, and that may inform our future development. Two other quick points about that. I think if you look at the Open Society and its Enemies, it is a work that is on the history of philosophy. It is essentially an argument that certain things were lost in the history of philosophy, and that by making certain decisions that we made, that were made, that a number of unfortunate consequences unfolded. So there is a Popperian use of history, a philosophy of history, almost, dare I say, a negative historicism here, where we are seeking to learn from history, not as a prescription, not to be prescriptive, but almost as a precaution in some respects. And part of what Popper does so eloquently and effectively, I think, in the Open Society, is a process of historical recovery. You know, here is Socrates as distinct from Plato. Here is Kant before he is distorted and mangled by Hegel. Here is Marx before he becomes a determinist. There are these interesting recoveries of positions that are the roads not taken, so to speak, or roads that were available but have generally become overgrown and neglected. That I think are very important to Popper, and indeed he keeps coming back even at the end of his life in the world of Parmenides to the pre-Socratics, to traditions that are worthy of recovery and new attention. So I think so historical recovery, a set of precautionary information from this, and also despite his general aversion to historicism, a sense in which we benefit from having an explanation of how we come to be where we are, and a sense of almost a sense of identity. I mean, one can find this interestingly in his comments on Marxism and indeed on the German social democratic movement, that there was a sense in which there was almost a religious optimism about the German workers that was informed by that understanding of history, which Popper actually regarded as worthy and desirable. Likewise, also in the history of science, although Popper is largely prescriptive in his approach to science, he does not simply say that this is how it was and this is therefore how scientists have to proceed. It was remarkably comfortable to occasionally draw historical corroboration in a non-verificationist way, of course, from his study of history. There is, indeed, scientists, great scientists, do seem to have acted in the way that Popper prescribes that scientists should act, and that there is that nice little element, not of course of confirmation, we would never use such a term, but of mere corroboration. I do have one other point that maybe you want to come back on this. I can see you keen to come back on. Did you want to come back on this?
No, all I was going to, look, I think what you're saying is right. I think at the same time that there are clearly contrasting stories can be told. And I think it's important that there be exploration of these and of differences in perspective without demonization. I mean, I have in mind two kinds of things. I mean, some critics of Popper's have said, well, he is very nice about the classical Athens, but really seems to be completely silent about nasty aspects of its imperialism. In a similar kind of way, it seems to me that Popper, through his association with working people in Vienna and their organizations, had a very elevated view of the capacities of ordinary people, and tended to dump on Plato for saying nasty things about democracy. On the other hand, having seen the kind of support that Donald Trump has attracted, for example, I mean, just the character of it, one has an exemplar of the very kinds of things that it seems to me Plato was concerned about. I mean, that one's got here someone who is an acute manipulator of people, yet people seem oddly to be led by and to continue being led by something that kind of, I mean, to get into one train wreck is a bad thing to happen. To immediately get back on the train for a replay of it is that much more worrying. And so I think that
well, they didn't learn from history, you see. That was a problem.
I think Popper's account is important, but that what one also needs to do is to have discussion, but it would clearly take another whole study of what kind of things go wrong, and how is it that people are attracted to kind of moralistic, crazy visions of things, which then stop them from being able to learn. And so I just say, yeah, I agree with you, but it looks to me to be a kind of multi-dimensional thing. It's also quite interesting that for Popper, really, the hero is often Kepler rather than Galileo, which again is really quite interesting.
Well, I agree on that, and as for the ancient Athenian writing, I think there is some aspects of Popper's work that does acknowledge, at least with Alcibiades and with various other of the characters that Thucydides identifies, the harmful side of Athenian democracy, and indeed even his references to Critias and Charmides and their ability to manipulate some of the support for a tyrannical savior of the people. So I don't entirely agree with you that Popper is unaware of the blemishes and the cacophony and the other side. I think he is entirely unfair to Plato in other respects, by the way, as I think I mentioned the other week. But can I turn to another point, which is I was very surprised, and I've made this point before, and you've told me to wait because you're about to bring it up. That in his writings on biology, interestingly enough, we have in the 1960s we have some new ideas which it seems to me might inform a new approach to history in Popper. So I'm thinking that in particular, you have in the objective knowledge volume, the evolutionary approach volume, there you have a number of new ideas that emerge that ought to suggest that Popper's conceptions of history, as worked out in at the end of the Open Society and indeed in the Positive Historicism, have been revisited, have been refreshed by slightly different approaches. He brings in, and you and I have referred to this in his Compton lecture, the concept of plastic control, which I think is remarkably interesting as a replacement almost for situational logic. Trying to understand how within a particular situation, rather like in your Helsinki situation, perhaps there are certain supposed agreements to certain norms that regulate behavior within that explain coordinated pursuit of activities within societies that almost, so to speak, provide a logic, a law-like, to refer to Ali's earlier point, regularity to social behaviors, as you pointed out with respect to the Nordic sense of time. What is that called? Chromatics. How different that is in different societies. So I think, you know, that there are aspects of Popper's approach to history which have been refreshed from the 1960s. His work on objective mind, you know, that controversial part of objective knowledge, which was originally titled an objective theory of history, which was interesting. It was published separately as an objective theory of history. Has that authentic? He was working simultaneously on a revision of his philosophy of history from the 1965. In fact, think of the 1966 Denver colloquium, where he produced that wonderful paper on realism in logic, philosophy, and history being included. That was preceded by a semester-long engagement at Denver, where he gave lectures on the philosophy of history. He was rewriting this along with his, I think, quite interesting engagements with biology and with the theory of objective knowledge, which seem to have been separated out from your treatment of Popper in history today. So I think perhaps that's I'll take.
There are two elements to it. I mean, the material that we've got from the course that he gave in Denver seems to me to be pretty disappointing. So, I mean, it's possible that you may go back and with this idea of plastic control, which clearly he was thinking about at the same time, you might be able to come up with something. I certainly, when I looked at it, didn't find that there was much in there which wasn't already pretty familiar, which contrasted with the Of Clouds and Clocks. It is really remarkable, because there in one lecture, one has all sorts of things jam-packed in. I had taken it that, as I've mentioned before, that the stuff about plastic control was really relating to, in part, his speculations about evolution and the role that culture can give, that anticipations of things can give, but also was being developed with an eye to his ideas about the mind-body problem. And so, I mean, I'm open to being convinced that there are new possibilities being opened up there with regard to history. As far as I know, he didn't tackle problems about the philosophy of history in a systematic way after that. I mean, what tended to happen is really that he gave sort of one-off lectures on things which tended to be rather broad-ranged, or the things that go into his some of the later collections of essays. And so I mean, you may be right that there is a possibility that's opened up by that, it certainly isn't something that had occurred to me, but that's neither here nor there. I'd like to see that developed, and then I might learn something from it.
I've been trying to work on precisely that for some while, and relating it to what I see as a kind of pivot in Popper's position in 1956-57. But
well, how about a paper to the next Popper conference, just briefly on that? That would be very nice.
I will try to do that. Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, there is one systematic presentation, and that is his Oxford lecture on the pluralist approach to the philosophy of history.
Yes,
but that's about it. That's available in the Myth of the Framework.
Yeah,
but I think you can read several of the chapters in Objective Knowledge as pertaining to that, including the Compton of Clouds and Clocks lecture, including realism in philosophy, history, and physics. So there is a connection with that, and the theory of the objective mind, which was, as I say, originally published in shorter version as objective theory of history, which yes, it addresses there in its title, I think, some of what he was addressing. But
what he does on that is this rather odd stuff about the an objective meaning of what particular historical characters in science were doing as having a significance beyond what they realized. And I mean, if you can knit this into something, I would be absolutely fascinated. All I'd say is, I think it's something which you're going to have to spell out, because it's not obvious. It's not obvious to me by your pointing at these things that any one construction leaps out of it.
Yes, I agree.
I fear that time has now caught up with us. Thank you all very much, particularly in view of the Popper conference yesterday. And what is going to be happening subsequently is I'm going to be talking about philosophy of social science, ethics, aesthetics, and then Popper the person. So that's the agenda for the rest of these lectures. And then there is, I think, for everyone, a welcome break. And I will then see if I could gird myself up to produce the second series, some of which I could give pretty much now, others of which are more just promissory notes to do something on a particular thing. So thank you all very much. Do get back to me by email with objections, criticisms, and so on. Thanks again.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, cheerio.